This video is all about the box model. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to identify and use all properties of the box model. So what is it? The box model is a pattern for positioning HTML elements on the page using CSS. It is the ability to be able to style elements and position them by way of CSS. And the box model is one of the most important skills in front-end development. All elements translate to pixels on the screen. So we use that idea to sort of draw a box around all of the things that we build. As we add styles and content to those elements, they start to get bigger. So a good way to visualize the box model is to start with every pattern you're going to see as you sort of develop this understanding of what the theoretical paradigm is built into the browser. The most outer concept of the box model around every single element is this idea of margins. Then we have the idea of a border that goes around our element, as well as some padding. You can think of padding as the space between your content and your border. And then, of course, the content itself. So every single HTML element falls under this paradigm, where we have an invisible margin around the element, a border that could be seen or solid. You know, you can make it 1 pixel or 3 pixels thick or whatever, a solid line, a dotted line or whatever, and then some padding that separates that border and the content, and then the content itself, which also gains some sort of weight. So the model's properties are fourfold. We have content, padding, border, and margin. Content is the space within the model in which our text and images are rendered. Okay, so it's the space that gets the thing that the user actually sees. Padding, let's go back to that last slide. Padding is the spacing between the content and the border. Okay, so you can sort of think about, like, if you have some text that says text and then some padding around that text, that's the space between the content and then the border of your content. And then a border we can style around the padding and the content of a box. We can actually style that border and, add some sort of element that shows the border of our box. And then, of course, margin, which sort of pushes things away from our elements. That's kind of what margins are used for. It's to take your element and to push your element away from other items. It's the space between the border and everything else on the page. So let's code, because that's the best way to figure out what the box model is and how to use it. Okay, if you open up Training Kit, you can go ahead and look at the follow along exercise there, and you can grab this example and port it over to CodePen. So we have this little div. Its class name is box example. I am a box, says the div. Let's use this box to figure out what the box model is all about. First thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to say box example. Select it with what type of selector is this? Do you remember? What could give it away? Well, there's a period before it, which means we must be selecting a class, so it's a class selector. So I'm going to change the background to gray. So we can now see that I have a gray background as I refresh the page, and our box spans the entire length of the screen. By default, that's what divs do. I'm going to bump up the importance of this. Didn't mean to zoom in that far, but this is fine. Let's go back out one item. And let's go back a couple items, actually. I zoomed in pretty far. Okay, and we will inspect the page. If you go and inspect it, just right click and click inspect. You can see that there is this box. This is the box model for all of our elements on our web pages. We have margin, border, padding, and content. So remember that margin, border, padding, content. This is how the box model is. This is what it does for us. Okay, and because we added those styles, our background is gray. Awesome. So let's look at the content area, because the first part of the box model we need to understand is our content area. In our HTML page, we currently have some text, I am a box. This text is taking up space and adding to the content area of our HTML element. This is great, but we can actually control the size of our content area by using width and height. let's add a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels to our box example. Zoom back out. I don't love the lack of space. I love space as a developer. So I am going to style the content area by simply adding 100 pixels in width, and we'll do the same thing with height. I'll save that, I'll run it, and notice how our thing changes. Our div doesn't span the entire length of the screen or width of the screen. If we were to select that, let's go ahead and inspect it. Let's see what changed on our box model here for our element. Notice that the content of this element is 100 by 100 pixels. It's a box, a square. Really neat. Just no padding, no border, and our margins are crazy because it's a div. It goes all the way across the screen. Remember, that margin is that imaginary line that goes across the screen there, or the imaginary area around our item here. Everything else is affecting of the item itself. Okay? So let's add some padding to this box. Padding is the area between our content and the border bounds of our box. So let's say that we want some padding of, give it 20 pixels. And this is shorthand for saying that I want to give it 20 pixels around the entire box. I could write this same exact thing by saying 20 pixels, top, right, bottom, left. Okay, let's go ahead and inspect that. Let's look at what our box is doing for us now. Notice that we got a little bit more complicated. Let's make sure we inspect the right thing. Margin is still 0 all the way around, but notice that padding gets 20 pixels, top, right, bottom, and left. Okay, so if we wanted to shorthand that, we could do simply this. This is saying I want to apply 20 pixels to the top, right, bottom, and left. And if we inspect the element, virtually nothing has changed. If I go and look, top, right, bottom, left. So you want to remember that top, right, bottom, left. If you don't understand or remember that, you're going to be in trouble. Okay? But this is styling the padding of our content. So the padding is the space between the content area and the border. Notice what happened to our I am a box text. Okay, I'm going to actually give this some color so that we can see it a little bit clear, a little bit more clear. Save that, run it. A little bit easier to read, I guess. So that's what padding does. There are ways to avoid some of the intricacies that we just have seen here. So notice that padding actually added 20 pixels to the side of our box. This can be an annoying side effect of using padding, and we need to make sure that we pay attention to how big our box is in case it doesn't match up with our design. So let's see where we can look at that. Our padding actually sort of added to the box. It got bigger. If we took that padding off, save it, run it, our box is actually a lot smaller. So this is an inherent side effect to the default behavior of HTML and CSS. We didn't want that box to be that big. We are now effectively 20 pixels wider, so we're 120 pixels all the way around, as opposed to being 100 pixels in height and width. So how do we change that? Well, there's this really cool kind of trick and hack that you can do to to this element by switching it so that it doesn't affect the padding all the way around. It only affects it inwardly. So we're going to use that trick called box sizing border box. Okay. This is going to constrain the padding inside the border's boundaries set by our width and height. So go ahead and add that to this element and let's see what happens. Let's go ahead and save that and run it. And we are back to normal. The designer gave us a file that said our content was to be 100 by 100 pixels, and we are no longer expounding that around the border or around the content. The border sits between our padding and our margins. Now that we've fixed our padding problem, we're going to add a border to this item. Okay. So I'm going to just type a note here. Remember to use border box for on box sizing to overwrite the currently bad behavior built into CSS HTML. Okay. It's a good thing to remember there. So border is straightforward in its visualization, but it can be a little confusing with the syntax. So we're going to add a border that's going to be 1 pixel solid red around this box. If I save that, you're going to notice that a red border just appeared around our box. And it's kind of hard to see that red, so I'm going to do 2 pixels and see if that changes our visualization here. Yes, it looks a little bit better. So you can see the border has 3 different values in it. We have the border size, the border style, and the border color. They can all be represented as a shorthand, or you can type them all the way out. And by doing so, we'll achieve the same results. Looks like I had a typo. By doing that, we should achieve the same exact results. Imagine if you had to type that out every single time. I would much prefer to do something like this than to worry about doing something like this. Okay? Okay, so border is pretty straightforward. We added a border around it. Doesn't really affect any of the height and width. In fact, it moved our content sort of inward, so to speak. Just added that border. So now what we want to look at is the margin. Margin is this white space that surrounds our border. Margin allows us to create distance between our element and the rest of the page. So if we visualize that in the box model, margin is this orange area around our content. Okay. So margin is pretty straightforward, and it's much like padding, where I can add 20 pixels all the way around, top, remember treble, top right, bottom left, save it, run it, and notice what happens to our content. It kind of shifts around the page. It was affected by the borders of the page. So this is very important to understand when you're trying to move elements around and move them away and give them the same margins and padding and borders. And it's very important to sort of understand this model. Now, one thing that's really cool about the box model is that it's actually a little bit, when we get into positioning and displaying in our next videos, we actually get a chance to sort of overwrite the existing behavior and then use a really cool layout format called Flexbox. And then utilizing that will sort of help you visualize and understand why it's important to know about padding and margins and borders. And we can dive in from there. So go ahead, there's a challenge found in your training kit for you to follow through with, and go ahead and get that complete.